I like to speak about 6 points today. First, very briefly, I talk about climate change. Then I show some interaction between food security or food insecurity and climate change, followed by specific information on climate change and agriculture. Finally, I come up with some consequences for microfinance related to climate change and a short conclusion. So, what means climate change in general? It is expected that over the next 100 years, the global temperature will increase by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The scientists assume that there will be less rainfall in summer and more rainfall during winter time, and there will be an increase in extreme weather events like droughts, floods, storms, or hail. If we talk about climate change, we should consider 2 aspects. How to deal with climate change. One is the climate adaptation and the other is climate mitigation. The question on climate adaptation is how can we adapt the effects of climate change, and the societal aim is the preparation for climate change. The second aspect, climate mitigation, there is a question, how can we weaken or prevent climate change? And the aim is to reduce the speed and the impact of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at agriculture, it is relevant to know that agriculture can be a sink of greenhouse gas emissions, but also a source. The biomass of agricultural crops, for instance, accumulate CO2 in sea, and this is a sink, but also agriculture is a source of greenhouse gases, emits greenhouse gases by the agricultural use of agricultural soils like bogs or livestock production. My talk will focusing on on climate adaptation issues. So this slide is taken from the latest FAO report on food and agricultural reading regarding climate change, agricultural and food security, which was published last Monday. Here you see a simulation on food insecurity and climate change vulnerability until 2050 for 3 scenarios. Left, a business as usual scenario. Right, you see a worst case scenario, and below you see a best case scenario. The charts show that in roughly 30 years, the best case scenario is more or less similar to the business as usual case, but the worst scenario shows much higher food insecurity, especially in Africa, but also in South America, Central Asia, and in Asia as well. So climate change affects the food security in our world. This link to agriculture, or the link between climate change and agriculture, is quite easy. If you see the effects caused by climate change, for instance, for Central Europe, the effects are higher temperature, especially at night and during winter time. We will have more and longer heat periods in summer, with climate over 35 degrees Celsius. We will have more or less the same amount of rainfall, but in different seasons. It is assumed that we will have less rainfall in summer and more rainfall in winter, which has consequences for the agricultural production. And as I already mentioned, there will be more extreme weather events. So these effects lead to longer vegetation periods with higher temperature. So longer vegetation periods sounds not too bad, can have positive but also negative impacts. A positive impact would be longer growing season and the opportunity for 2 harvests per year. But the majority of impacts are negative ones, especially in the long run, like water scarcity. And by the end, it leads to less yield per agricultural unit, and the higher risk due to climate change have consequences for farming and the related businesses. So one of the first consequences is that climate change is regional differentiated, and that's why it's needed very specific regional solutions. And the second consequences from the MFI perspective is we have to deal with this higher risk, the higher vulnerability in agriculture, and as well in the related value chain. Here the FAO quoted the dimension we talk about in this issue. The FAO counts that 122 million people could drive into extreme poverty by climate change until 2030. 2030, it's not really a long period until then, it's just in the next 15 years, so it's quite soon. And the question is, how can we adapt to the climate change? And there are a few very effective measures we can mention in this context. There's one, the nitrogen efficient crop varieties. Then there's a approach called climate smart agriculture or no-till farming approach. I will explain in a minute. And another technology would be heat-tolerant crop varieties. Also good measures, but not so effective measures, are drought-relevant crop varieties to implement to improve the irrigation system and to invest in water harvesting measures. Further, the FAO mentioned that the improvement in infrastructure, extension services, climate information and market access and credit and insurance systems are deeply needed, and furthermore there should be a linkage between agriculture and climate financing. So as I already mentioned, one very effective technology is the climate smart agricultural approach. Here are two different aspects combined. First, we have sustainable increasing of agricultural productivity and incomes. Behind this is the knowledge that the global population will grow very fast for the next decades, and on the other hand, we have declining arable land for agricultural use in the world. So, if we want to feed all people, we have to get more from the unit as today in a sustainable way. So that's the first column. The second column is the adaptation and building resilience to climate change. And the third one is the reducing or removing of greenhouse gas emissions where possible. This, the last column is, for instance, livestock production, as I already mentioned, is the source of greenhouse gas emissions. So here we should reduce it on a global perspective. It is quite small, but it is possible, especially in the industrialized countries. So here you see as well the regional differentiated of this climate change aspects. This climate smart agriculture approach was launched by the FAO in 2010 and is also promoted by the World Bank, for instance. To deal with climate change is often a question of access, and the access means different dimension, access to resources like specific seeds or crops who are resilient to climate change, or the access to fertilizer, but also access to manpower or finance. Beside that, access to knowledge is needed, and here we need knowledge on data like weather data, but also on technology and approaches like bioenergy practices, like sustainable land management, or as I already explained, the climate smart agriculture technologies. Here is also needed access to training or to well-informed extension services as a mediator for knowledge transfer. And the third access which is needed is the access to markets, or the access to aggregators like suppliers or food production value chains. These are highly relevant issues to deal with climate change, and especially from the perspective of smallholders. Now I like to introduce a network which is working on to improve the access of knowledge on climate change. This network is called WOCAT network. WOCAT stands for World Overview of Conservation Approaches and Technologies. WOCAT is a global network on sustainable land management experts of different levels and different institutions on national, regional and international level in over 60 countries. At the moment, more than 2,000 experts are registered in this network. The aim is to support innovation and decision-making processes in sustainable land management, particularly in connection with soil and water conservation, with a strong agricultural or land use approach. This aim will be reached by different instruments. First, the connecting of stakeholders, and this is a really important issue to establish practical solutions in this topic. Then they use evidence-based and further analysis for generating data and knowledge as well. Then they are enhancing capacity and knowledge by providing, sharing and using knowledge, and the last instrument they use are standardization, documentation and evaluation for their contents. Sounds not really spectacular, but in bringing together the knowledge of so many different kinds of experts around the world, has a real impact and provides a lot of knowledge on sustainable land management in quite different levels. This slide shows you some products of Vocard. Okay. Sorry about this. Here you can see more regional products like the book on sustainable land management technology and approaches in Ethiopia, but also in Central Asia, but also more general products, but like the book on water harvesting. Furthermore, the Vocard network invites people to show their sustainable land management practice in short videos. Like here, you see an instructional video on conservation agriculture, or in the video on increase of application of organic fertilizer in Kyrgyzstan. This video shows quite well how small innovation in energy efficiency measures can improve also farming of smallholders and as well have an impact on climate adaptation and in the long run on food security. So there are a lot of products available at the website for different countries, especially Africa, Asia and South America. So now finally I'd like to come briefly to more financial aspects of climate smart agriculture. To achieve agricultural growth for food security and under climate change, more activity in sustainable agricultural intensification are needed. These activities on climate smart agriculture efforts, financial investments. So far, there are a large financial gap for climate smart agriculture, but also some barriers to close these gaps. For instance, the FAO mentioned the gender gap. We listened, I think, last week in the talk from Patricia as well. There is another gap regarding the rights to land and water, and the third gap is thin or non-existing credit or insurance markets. As well, the lack of well-informed extension services or poor agricultural value chains. To close the financial gap, it is necessary to build up an evidence base to identify the most suitable activity on climate adaptation. As I mentioned, climate change is regionally differentiated, and farming always deals with the specific signed conditions on soil and water and so on. So the analyses are required to establish climate smart agricultural investment and financial plans suitable for this specific region or each specific region. At the moment, often the focus is either on climate adaptation or climate mitigation measures. This separation should be avoided. More effects have investments with impacts on both, as also the climate smart agricultural approach requires. And now I'm already coming to my conclusion, and I like to highlight some important aspects. First, climate change and food security are two remaining topics for the next decades. Definitely, these are the topics we have to deal with. We have to cope with these challenges. Evidence-based investments on sustainable agricultural intensification. So sorry about this. To cope with these challenges, we need evidence-based investments on agricultural intensification. The adaptation on climate change needs access to resources, to knowledge, as has shown, and to markets as well. And microfinance products should include both aspects of climate change, climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So how can we adapt climate change and how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? That was a short, briefly introduction on climate change and agricultural use, land use. So thank you for your attention and I'm looking for your questions.